Okay, it looks like we are live. Hey, everybody. We'll give it a couple minutes for everybody to join. This is Jesse from Energy Web, Chief Commercial Officer and co-founder, and I've got who everybody should know with me, Sam Hartnett, also from the Energy Web team.
Good morning or afternoon or evening, wherever you're joining us from.
Yes, indeed. So let's see. Yep, we got a few people popping in. Hey, everybody. And I do believe Kobar from the Energy Web community, who's one of our rockstar moderators, is going to be hopping into the YouTube channel in a minute to help get the questions and everything going. So welcome, everybody. What's going on in Colorado today, Sam?
Sunshine and blue skies. So it's been nice for getting outside and going for walks or hanging out in the backyard, but could really do with some more snow. And it looks like some of that's on the way before the end of the week.
Nice. Good. Yep, well, it's gray and bad out here. So anyway, okay, cool. It looks like we've got, there he is. So Kobar is in. So let's go ahead and jump in. So thanks everybody for all of the awesome questions. We had an action-packed week last week with a series of announcements, whether it was the Kraken exchange listing, Volkswagen joining the community, lots of really interesting, fun stuff that we're excited to talk about with the community. High level, we were going to cover two topics before we jump into all the questions that we got from everybody, and then we'll also be taking questions from YouTube. The first one, we got to talk about Bitcoin sustainability and Energy Web. And so we're going to spend a bit of time on that. We've got a lot of conversations and really interesting work going on in that space. Second, Sam, I'm going to turn it over to you. Want to jump in on the staking model or the escrow model? Well, we put out a bunch of documentation. This would be a really good opportunity, I think, for us to have a conversation and try and help explain it to the broader community to know what's going on there. And then we'll kick it over for Q&A from everybody. And we've got a big laundry list of questions that we're going to try and get through as many as we can. And then we'll also take some more from the YouTube channel. So let's go ahead and jump in. This is probably not news to anyone that's tuned in now, but of course, Bitcoin's run since the end of 2020 has really brought new levels of attention to the BTC asset class. And now the topic has really gone mainstream. I'd encourage you to go to the front page of the New York Times and check out the front page of the digital part of the website, headline, Bitcoin's climate problem. So this is definitely something that I think we have been anticipating, sort of thinking about, well, Bitcoin's going to run into some of the sustainability stuff at some point. Well, it's kind of here. We'd also been getting a lot of great questions from the community, reading a few of them verbatim. Can mined Bitcoins be made green? How can the Energy Web stack help in this space? Have potential BTC buyers approached you to help make Bitcoin green? And then my favorite is, when is Energy Web going to help kill the notion that BTC can't be green? So whoever asked that one, good on you. Yeah. So all awesome questions, and we want to dig into it a little bit. Something we've been watching really closely, just for folks that aren't kind of really active in the BTC community, the sheer scale of investment and holdings of Bitcoin by large corporates and funds is truly shocking right now. So Square has something like over 8,000 Bitcoins. MicroStrategy, Michael Saylor's shop, 91,000. I think that's valued at 4 billion USD or something right now. Tesla, 48,000 Bitcoin. And then if you look at all of these other funds, the list just goes on. I think one called Grayscale BTC Trust has 650,000 Bitcoins in it, right? And I'm offering all these numbers up to the community to really try and hammer home how important this New York Times story is. If the Bitcoin community is going to keep growing via a lot of these corporate infusions of cash to basically hold Bitcoins or use them transactionally, this whole somewhat real, but also somewhat perceived issue around Bitcoin carbon intensity really has to be overcome. At least that's how I look at it, Sam. I don't know if you've been thinking about it at all.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot more nuance to the whole discussion, I think, than the headlines would lead you to believe. But you're right, there is, part of it is perception and part of it is reality. And I think the writing is on the wall that BTC as an asset class is here to stay. I mean, just one other anecdote is, you see even the likes of JP Morgan now, whose CEO Jamie Dimon had historically, really been anti-BTC to say the least, and now making recommendations to their clients to, make something on the order of 1%, of their assets as a hedge in Bitcoin. And so the tide's really turning. And so if it's going to be mainstream and here to stay, it's incumbent upon all of us, I think, in the wider crypto community, and especially those who are in the Bitcoin community more deeply, to really think about how to tackle this problem head on.
Definitely. And when I look at this topic, I just see an opportunity for a mega triple win kind of scenario if we can help decarbonize Bitcoin. And so I think, like, from my perspective, if you're a climate hawk, kind of where the perspective from the New York Times piece is coming from today, if we decarbonize Bitcoin fully, right, that's a win for climate. Okay. By decarbonizing Bitcoin, we can also produce a win for the renewable energy industry. Bitcoin uses a massive amount of electricity. Why not use that electricity to grow markets for renewables, right? If we can get Bitcoins coming purely from renewable electricity, that's a huge win. That's kind of decarbonizing an entire industry. So we got a win for climate, folks. We got a win for the renewable energy industry if we can decarbonize it. And then the third one, probably the most obvious one, is for the Bitcoin community. If Bitcoin can become green and not just greenwashed for marketing purposes, but really, every Bitcoin is tied to a specific renewable energy facility, that means a lot of these sustainability barriers can come down and more individuals and organizations can come into Bitcoin. So I think it's a huge opportunity. And one of the questions we were getting from Reddit and some of the other threads was definitely about, well, how can Energy Web's tech stack help? And kind of my basic answer is Zero specifically is really, the technology that we can use to nail this. One example for how Zero could be used to decarbonize Bitcoin. Let's say a big corporate comes in, like the ones we just talked about, purchases a tranche of Bitcoins and is sitting on them. Well, we can calculate, how much carbon is that Bitcoin holding responsible for, take that as an input to Zero, and then use Zero to help that organization go and purchase renewables somewhere in the world to basically make their Bitcoin holdings green, right? That's one way we could use Zero. We could also use Zero so that if you're a retail Bitcoin buyer going into an exchange, you can actually agree to a really small, certainly less than 1%, probably less than 0.5%, though I haven't run the specific math, fee in Bitcoin for that Bitcoin to then be used to fund renewables in a specific place to help decarbonize that retail BTC purchase. There's also a lot of other stuff going on that Zero actually could be used to trace, but it's just happening independently. There's no reason that big corporates can't embark on negative carbon kinds of projects, plant trees. There's no reason corporates can't go and take down in renewable energy land what's called a power purchase agreement, where they try and offset some of their Bitcoin load. So there's all kinds of ways to do it, but I'd say it's not a technology problem. This whole point around decarbonizing Bitcoin, I think, is a community building and almost political challenge to try and pull together the ecosystem to do something there. And that's kind of where we are just for the community. So we've been in discussion with a number of these different stakeholders, both in kind of the energy world where a lot of us sit, but also in the Bitcoin ecosystem, to think about what sort of initiative can we launch to help make Bitcoin more green. We have the technology kind of stack there, but the challenge now is the community building piece of it. So we have something in the works that we're hopefully able to announce in the next couple of weeks on this specific topic. But suffice to say, a lot of energy, a lot of excitement, and a huge opportunity that you'll probably see some additional announcements from our side in the coming weeks on this. So anyway, that was my brief Bitcoin rant. We'll come back to it. I see some other questions coming up. But Sam, let's shift gears to talk a little bit more specifically about all of this great work and announcements that came out last week on staking.
Yeah, definitely. Well, before maybe jumping right into that, can help set the context for kind of why these announcements are coming out now, how we're thinking about it, and what ultimately we're trying to achieve. So hopefully many people had, in addition to reading the article that came out kind of on the specifics of the escrow model, had also read Walter's piece on this concept of service level agreements and how important they are to widespread commercial adoption of new technologies. And that is really speaking from Walter's decades of experience working in the telco sector, banking, these really big industries with really high performance and security requirements for the digital technologies that they invest in. And when we look at the energy sector, it's equally as complex, if not even more so in a lot of cases, because we're dealing with physical assets and physical security and reliability of energy systems, and even more specifically the grid. So as we've been talking with a lot of our members and seeing more and more projects getting launched and built, just to name a few, the announcement recently on the flexibility platform in Spain, some of the work around things like supply chain tracking and lifecycle asset management. In addition to all the work that you were mentioning, it could be Zero, it could be Origin, really anything. For these applications to scale in a way where we're going to make an impact on our mission of, we want millions of green energy assets using this technology stack in many dozens or hundreds of countries, the level of reliability and guarantees that need to be there in order for that level of adoption don't really exist yet. And so we've been thinking about how can we provide the levels of assurances to all of these companies, both large and small, who are looking to build on the Energy Web technology stack. How can we replicate all the benefits of kind of conventional IT procurement that has a lot of contracts and legal agreements to guarantee that performance? How do we do that in a decentralized way?
And would one way to, because I'm still trying to figure out different ways to explain this to the community as well, would one way to think about this be, so consensus in the blockchain protocol layer for any of these blockchains is quite robust now in a lot of different ways. But are what you're talking about here, so that concept of decentralized consensus, right? We're talking about applying it at the next layer, right? So not just about validating a blockchain, but basically saying, well, wait a minute, there's all of these other, like you just said, IT services that developers need to run an application. So is that kind of is that the right analogy, trying to figure out how can we bring a kind of decentralized environment to those utility services, not just the blockchain consensus layer?
Yeah, that's a great point. So, I think there's sometimes a misconception that if you're building an application on a blockchain, that you're doing the whole thing on the blockchain. Right. And then people ask about things like transactions per second and how much does it cost to store data. There are a lot of different ways that people have gone about trying to answer or solve some of those questions. And in some cases, it's let's build a different consensus mechanism to make a higher performing blockchain. Our approach has been, don't use the blockchain for things that it's not really well suited to. And in our architecture, the Energy Web chain is really used for that consensus service, really. It's building that trust, anchoring certain events or data where you need that multi-party consensus and that trust. Then there are these second layer services that, just to name a few, one of the ones that came out recently is the Key Manager that our colleague Adam's been working on. It is a key generation and recovery service that would allow people who are either wanting to have some kind of way to back up their keys, or who maybe aren't comfortable storing private keys or aren't familiar with the concept, to basically gain the benefits of that public-private key pair cryptography with the simplicity of a login with your email type of application. So that's just one service, but others include high volume messaging for device to device communication. We're looking at things like decentralized data storage, other ways to query data from the chain, cache it, and then make it really highly available so that you have a higher performing app without having to read and structure data from the chain itself. So these are
Got it.
all IT services that are going to make applications perform the way that everybody expects in a, in a modern IT architecture. And instead of having single companies providing these services directly to those application developers, basically the way that these IT services work today, how can we take some of the lessons and the architectures from the blockchain world and the blockchain layer and apply them at this IT services layer? And so one way to think about it is almost like what we're talking about is a proof of stake system, but instead of a consensus layer, for a IT service layer.
Mm.
And one of the reasons that we think this is such an important piece for the energy web context is that, again, we're talking about um, our members represent, I don't know the exact count, but I know at least among the validators, right? The validators are 20 different countries, and the members collectively represent something around 200 million customers.
Yep.
So in order to support that level of scale, we're going to need many providers of these IT services across different countries, running hundreds to maybe thousands of nodes to really have the geographic reach and the performance level necessary to support all of these applications at scale. And so a way to have a level of trust and reliability in that kind of organic, decentralized approach to spinning up these services all around the world is taking a lot of the lessons learned from established proof of stake mechanisms, which I'll also point out are probably in some ways based on a lot of other more traditional financial assurance or security deposit like models that you see totally outside of the crypto world.
Yeah, got it. Okay, cool. So I never thought about it like that. Proof of authority at the chain level, but almost proof of stake at this utility layer level. And if I understand it right, really the primary user we're building for is one of these large energy enterprises. They need to build some application. They've got the chain, but they need these other services. We're trying to create an environment for them where they don't have to enter into some nasty long-term negotiation where they're locked in for multiple years to a single IT service provider. The point is, how can we just set up a decentralized network of these utility nodes so that all of those application operators and developers can just access these services, whether it's Key Manager or something else? So talk us through an example. And specifically, do I have it right that there's really use the roles that you put out in that Medium post to talk the audience through specifically, like, what does this look like from the different kind of perspectives? Ah, yes, I love this drawing, by the way.
Yeah, this I think is probably my my most prized piece of artwork that I've created, since elementary school. But yeah, you mentioned that we're designing the system in some ways for these large enterprises. That's one of the key roles, definitely, and that's more of the audience for who is going to use this decentralized IT service layer, because they're the ones building the applications, using those applications for their customers to accomplish some kind of business objective in whatever market context they're operating in. There's two other roles that are highlighted in the piece from last week that I want to walk through. And I think it all starts really first at the provider. So in blue here, this role is for any organization, so businesses large and small, or even universities, research institutions, any organization that wants to host nodes in this IT services layer can become eligible to participate in this system by making a deposit of EWT into a smart contract. So just like in a proof of stake model, or in outside of crypto, financial assurance in any kind of regulated market. So that's really as a demonstration that they're going to be reliable, they're committed to delivering the services, and they have something to lose if they fail to deliver on those obligations. The way that a provider can acquire those EWT in order to make that deposit can take a couple different forms. They can, some of them might be existing energy web chain validators, but as we mentioned before, we're talking on a scale much larger than this. So organizations who aren't currently part of the ecosystem but want to participate can obviously write EWTs now on exchanges, so they can acquire those EWT themselves, or they can accept EWT from the wider community. And so we call that role those EWT holders who want to back these providers patrons. And so the role of a patron is to look at the different providers who are out there and evaluate them based on how reliable are they? Are they delivering the services in accordance with their commitments? And the reason that that is important is because the revenue that a provider will earn and ultimately share with its patrons is directly tied to its performance in the utility layer and to how many services it's operating, how many nodes it has. So there's this natural competition that providers are incentivized to deliver the highest quality services, not just to max in their own interests, but also to attract patrons and make sure that they then have the necessary resources available to continue to participate and to operate more nodes, serve more customers.
Got it. So just to make sure this is clear, so in the middle, you've got a provider. So this is basically a company, large, small, doesn't matter, that has gone through some sort of a KYC check. So it's been identified. That provider is then able to stand up a node if they meet the minimum staking requirements, which I have another question about in a minute. So they meet the staking requirement, whether directly or by accepting EWT from patrons. So that's effectively delegated proof of stake, right? In that kind of architecture. Okay. And then assuming that all checks out, that provider is providing services to the right side of this chart. So you have a subscriber, that's the application developer. Is that right? So the actual company using the services?
Exactly. We think, in the vast majority of cases, that will be the subscriber is a company or an enterprise who is developing the applications. It could be an individual if you were just a member of the community and you had your own personal need for having some of these services. But in most cases, that should be a company.
Got it. Okay, great. So providers providing the services, subscriber gets the services. And there are, how did you describe it? Because it's not blockchain consensus, but we're actually these utility layer nodes, how do we know that those services are being delivered? What's the thinking there? You mentioned in the piece the concept of fishermen from the Polkadot kind of ecosystem. So is the thinking similar, that there'll be some sort of a agent or something checking that these utility layer nodes are doing what they say they're doing?
Yeah, so I wish I had the perfect and final answer for you. This is actually a really complex technical question that I think probably not just ourselves, but many people working in this space are thinking about. And this is definitely an opportunity, I think, if people in the community are aware of other projects that are focused on this decentralized approach to monitoring and verification and enforcement, not at the blockchain layer, but in this second layer of IT services, definitely get in touch. We have a number of ideas of how to solve this technically, and I can kind of walk through at a high level how we're thinking about it. If people are interested in going further down the rabbit hole, we'd probably need to bring in some of our colleagues. But
got it.
Yeah,
okay.
As you mentioned, we envision there's another role that's not on this slide, but basically a watchdog set of nodes or services that their role is to basically query all of the active nodes on a regular interval and make sure that they are able to deliver the services that are in accordance with the rules set out for each service. So I can use an example for one of the services, again, might be that cache server for caching data from the chain and providing it in a really high availability database structure. So the rules for that service might say, a node must be able to support 10,000 concurrent requests it must be available 99.999% of the time. It must be running this exact version of the software client, and it must have certain resources at the server level in terms of, let's say, memory and bandwidth and things like that. So these other agents would basically be polling and testing every cache server node to make sure that they're actually meeting those requirements.
Right.
And
Okay.
if one is found that it doesn't, that's when that node would lose some of its stake.
Got it. So if we were to draw that, there would basically be these agents watching the utility layer nodes. That's kind of the enforcement mechanism for the.
Yeah, and then there's also different approaches that I only understand at a high level, but basically, just like in the blockchain layer, you can design the software client to basically work exactly as defined in the protocol or fail completely. That similar approach to this, meaning that if it is delivering the service, by definition, it is doing it correctly. Otherwise, it would have failed.
Yep.
So lots of different ways to approach that. But in combination, the intent is to then basically provide that guarantee to the subscriber that if when you pay for these services, you are going to get exactly this level of service, this quantity of service in terms of, let's say, requests per day or latency. So you can feel really confident that because these providers, have something at stake and also, are incentivized to deliver the services in order to win your business, that you can be extremely confident that what you pay for is what you're going to get. And in the event that there is some disruption, there is a mechanism where you will be refunded, some of that to compensate you for that disruption. Very similar to how these service level agreements work, in practice today.
Excellent. Okay. Would you mind zooming out? I just want to be able to see a couple of the other questions or stopping the screen share.
Sure.
Excellent. So the last piece on this, just to, again, come back to kind of more of the provider and the patron side of that equation. I know that some of the specifics are still under design with the team, but can you talk a little bit about the UX for this? Have we put ranges down in terms of the lockup period for these different staking models? And also speak a little bit about the community fund. What kind of role does that play? Those are kind of the three questions coming from the community.
Yeah, definitely. So as far as the UX and the UI, so all of this is going to be based on the decentralized identifier, or the DID architecture. So what's really cool about this is in this system, every single agent, let's say, which can be a person who, a member of the community who's going to become a patron, or a provider who's an organization, or an actual server, a physical node, every single one of those entities has a DID and then has a list of specific roles that it acquires based on its attributes and based on the different claims that it's made. And so this allows for really specific mapping of patrons to providers, providers to nodes, subscribers to nodes, and it allows for a lot of customization there. And so all of that fits really neatly into Switchboard, which I know many people have maybe experimented with a little bit. But the idea is you would basically use Switchboard as this high-level portal to enroll not just in applications, but also participate in the escrow model, maybe as a patron, stake on behalf of a provider. And then how you actually do that, you can use your hardware wallet in Switchboard. You can also use something like the key manager. There's a lot of flexibility, but that's the initial plan, is having all that UX in Switchboard. Longer term, we see a lot of value in also partnering with some of the other exchanges and other external platforms that are in the ecosystem to make it even easier for both individuals, but especially larger institutions to participate in this as well. And so that's kind of further on down the line, but something that we're certainly thinking about as far as the UX. On the specifics of kind of the thresholds and the lockup period, yeah, we've been thinking about this internally and starting to have discussions with some of the Energy Web member companies around the specifics. This has been many months in process. In the piece last week, we highlighted a range of between 10,000 and 100,000 EWT as a baseline for the provider, and then an incremental amount of between 1,000 and 10,000 EWT per node. Yeah, we're continuing to solicit feedback from the community, right? And there, it's a real balance between how do you create, how do you make it high enough, basically, so that there really are these strong and powerful incentives to create or to invest in the appropriate resources to deliver high quality services and really make sure that the providers have something truly at stake, versus not creating a completely insurmountable barrier that doesn't actually allow for true decentralization and community participation. So trying to strike the right balance there, and we'll be, like we mentioned, continuing to publish articles in the coming weeks, and would certainly encourage anybody to provide feedback, either commenting in that Medium article or in some of the other channels.
And somebody did just put, wow, so staking seems years away. No, that is not the case. We will speak about timelines, et cetera, in a moment and how to get involved. But how about on the kind of high level lockup period? I think I saw in the piece that for a provider, we're talking about 1 to 2 years potentially for the provider piece, but then very different for the patron piece. Can you talk through that a little bit?
Yeah, so a provider, again, these are intended to be companies who should be making a business decision to, this should become a new business model for these different types of companies, right? Becoming an IT service vendor, basically, in a decentralized network. And on the subscriber side, if you are a large enterprise and you're making a decision about launching an application at scale with, let's say, hundreds of thousands or millions of users, you need to be really confident that if your technology choice is going to suddenly change its performance or disappear in a few months' time, you're just not going to choose that. So for providers, indeed, having that multi-year commitment is important, but equally so for patrons, it's important that there is true competition and flexibility so that patrons can basically vote with their feet and choose the providers who are delivering the best quality services. And so there's no specific rules there at the macro level. That said, each provider might have their own custom terms for accepting patrons. That'll be up to them, but that's not something that will be universal at the network level.
Understood. Okay. And I guess the last piece, and I can maybe try and explain this one, correct me if I'm wrong. So the community fund was on the diagram. Long-term, the thinking is this model is truly circular and supports itself. So you have all those subscribers in the real world procuring IT services through this utility layer. Those payments support the entire system. That's it. Very simple. No interest payments needed, right? Or any annual return like most staking models. In order to get to that level of maturity, again, we need thousands of these nodes out there. So the idea is we use the community fund to incent both the providers and the patrons to stand up these services. That's pretty simple. So any of these revenue numbers that were put in the Medium posts with kind of these ranges between 10 to 20% sort of returns, gross returns, that is on an annual basis, that were in the Medium posts. That's the idea, is the community fund is used as an incentive mechanism for all of this staking and all of these providers to come into the ecosystem. And then over time, that's not even necessary because these payments are just circulating through the whole network.
Yeah, exactly. It's a little bit about solving the chicken and egg problem, right? Yep. No companies are going to make this decision to enter the utility layer and participate in staking if there isn't demand from the enterprises and the customers. Customers aren't going to get excited and take it seriously if there isn't already a really robust network in place. And so the community fund kind of acts as this catalyst to bootstrap this network in the initial years, really make it robust and create it so that it's staying ahead of the demand, especially in the first several years, so that it can start to scale as more and more of these projects that we know are coming online this year and through the next couple of years.
Excellent. Okay, cool. Before we turn to questions from the community, yeah, how about the high level timeline as described earlier? And I think this was also in the Medium post, but go ahead and just recap it for the community.
Yes, I mean, the main takeaway should be our goal is to launch the full escrow and subscription model for 2 utility layer services in the 3rd quarter of this year. Working backwards from there, I mentioned there are some kind of technical architecture decisions and things going on really at that the monitoring and implementation side of things. So what to expect over the next couple of months. Through the end of March and into April, we're going to be publishing more demos, show actually some of the working prototypes that we have to give people a better sense for what the UX looks like. Then we're going to work with the Energy Web Chain validator community. So these are companies that have already actually gone through a very similar experience in launching the chain itself. I think there's a lot of parallels that can be drawn.
Yep.
So that'll kind of be the initial cohort to test this out in kind of an alpha and a beta release. And then having this live really for the whole community and having these services in production in the 3rd quarter is the target. So not tomorrow, but certainly not years, as somebody commented.
All right. Excellent. Well, thanks for that description, Sam. And I think for the rest of the community, we do intend in the next quarter to put out more explainers that abstract even more of this description away in terms of how this entire system works. It is complicated, but that's because we're doing something that simply has not been done before, trying to decentralize not the blockchain, but these harder, air quotes, IT services that are necessary for these applications. So we look forward to putting out more kind of explainer content on this topic, and please continue to engage with us. We can do very specific explanatory sessions on the AMAs about different pieces here. As we have more software, I imagine, Sam, we can give demos. So more to come on this for sure. Yeah. Cool. Well, let's flip to questions, and let's go rapid fire through some of these. They're all over the place, so let's go ahead and jump in. Question 1. Recent snowstorm in Texas, here in the US, left many without power. There were electric bills that cost thousands of dollars for some individuals and families. How can an electric grid that runs kind of in our vision, with the Energy Web stack injected into it, what would that look like? Could we prevent some of the worst parts of what happened in Texas if our vision was there? What do you think, Sam?
Yeah, I mean, so what happened in Texas is both in some ways really unique to Texas and the way that grid is designed and some of the unique weather factors and things that went into it. But it's also kind of a microcosm of what the broader impact of extreme weather driven by climate change represents. So I think the biggest takeaway from that, but also things where you live in California, wildfires of last year, we're seeing more and more of these tail events that grid planners used to discount or not even imagine. Right, in Texas, it was both colder and demand was higher than even the most extreme forecasts. So I think there's a mindset shift that needs to happen at a really high level of how do we kind of redesign at a system-wide level what a grid looks like to better withstand some of these extreme events. And so that, in our view, looks like a lot more local resources, a lot more, community scale and even individual building level generation, storage, flexible loads. So putting more local resources to solve those local problems doesn't necessarily completely avoid, every single worst case scenario, but it just builds in that level of resiliency to better withstand, failures of natural gas generation, let's say, or transmission failures. And one of the reasons that that's a really hard grid architecture is that there is this mass data coordination, visibility, sharing, and that's coming back to the energy web. Like that's what we try to solve for to make it easier to realize that type of grid architecture.
Yeah, the simplest way I've explained it to family members that have asked me the same question, it's a great question, is lots of stuff went wrong in Texas, just like lots of stuff went wrong in California this summer with the rolling blackouts, where many different things can help solve those problems. You described some of them. Making electric grids bigger is probably step one, right? Texas is islanded for all intents and purposes from the rest of the US electricity system. That's a problem because if the Texas grid goes down, it can't call for help. So there's lots of things that can happen. From the Energy Web perspective, I think it's pretty simple. Basically, grid operators have next to zero visibility into things like heat pumps, electric vehicles, batteries, these resources that have been deployed on the network because we're all investing and buying in them, right? If we're in those markets, we can give grid operators near real-time insight using the chain, using all the utility layer stuff that you just talked about to those assets. And if grid operators have access to all of those assets at the grid edge, just like you said, it gives them another tool to fight against these kinds of massive disruptions and stuff like that. So that's how I'd kind of think about it. Okay, cool. That was probably the wonkiest question that we're going to have to answer. The next one, pretty simple. Question on zero, is EWT used in Energy Web Zero? Yes, the tokenomics there are just like Sam described for every other use case on the Energy Web stack. If you're using the chain or you're using any of these utility services, it's a DID based approach to interacting with all of that. And the payments for all of those services that are happening behind the scenes happen in Energy Web Token. So yes, that's the entire architecture of the whole stack. Flipping gears a little bit, lots of folks from the community really come from a background of like impact investing, I guess would be the right language. And they're primarily interested in reading the question now in supporting projects that advance sustainability. So there's a suggestion from the community to see various metrics. For example, how much CO2 has been offset through the Energy Web stack. Is that something we've been tracking, or is it even feasible for us to implement something like that?
Yeah, I mean, we have discussions to that effect pretty much on a weekly basis. And there's kind of two sides of the same coin on this. So on the one hand, it's actually in some ways kind of difficult to really measure some of this stuff because in this DID based architecture, kind of that data privacy is just baked in to a lot of what actually happens on the chain. And so there are applications or users that could certainly share that. And maybe there's more we could do as Energy Web to provide that type of format or venue for them to share that and aggregate it up.
But for example, I got the question the other
them.
day, tell me how many Tesla Model 3s are on the Energy Web stack. I said, I have no idea, and neither do you, right? Because of this DID-based architecture. Users would have to voluntarily, or enterprises for some reason, and there may be a good business reason to do so, would have to basically say, here's the data I'm going to disclose about this asset.
Exactly. So on there's kind of like the challenging part. The part that I think makes me at least kind of optimistic about it is that, we have set out, I think it was even now a couple of years ago about, what is our mission and kind of what's our theory of change. And, we've outlined it here, but, we're on a mission to create gigawatt or gigaton scale CO2 reductions, in emissions globally. And so we want to track that. And, with things like Zero and with Origin, a lot of that tracking is kind of natively built into the app. That's one of the key value propositions. So for things like that, I think it will be easier, and we have some of our colleagues that are actually working on this specifically. And then with things like Zero, once we expand into other sectors, you were talking about the Bitcoin example earlier. If there's already that known carbon impact, and then you're associating it directly with some of the purchasing activity, there's a much cleaner kind of one-to-one relationship and maybe easier reporting there. So
nice.
Definitely something that's going to continue to evolve, but great question.
Great. Couple of questions on exchanges. So we had the Kraken announcement this week, question on the US Canadian access to it, and then other exchanges. So a couple things for the community on this one. We have gone through detailed diligence with additional exchanges. And look, Sam, myself, the rest of the team, and the broader community, we all get the importance of having EWT listed and out there on as many top tier exchanges as possible. We can't achieve the kind of vision we're talking about here without enterprises all around the world using the Energy Web stack. So absolutely is top of mind for us. And for better or worse, we as EnergyWeb are not in control of business decisions of these exchanges. The entire listing process and is quite opaque in a lot of these cases, and we don't have much insight as to what's going on at any given time. The last point on the exchange piece is, again, from the get-go and to this day, on the EnergyWeb side, we're very clear about the utility function of the EnergyWeb token. This is why we've gone through legal processes in multiple geographies around the world about the classification of the token. Again, we're not in charge of driving the business decisions of the exchanges, but look at what we just talked through with this entire model to enable corporates and other users to use EnergyWeb token to access lots of different services, right? Our model is continuing to evolve and really forge a new path in terms of what these kinds of cryptocurrencies can be used for. Yeah. So the utility status of EWT, again, just look at what we're building. It's just taking off like a rocket ship. So absolutely confident in the status of of the entire community and how this stack is working and how the token relates to it. We're not in charge of the business decisions of the exchanges. So that's current status. As soon as we know anything else, we'll of course communicate it with our partners throughout the community, but that's where we are on that. Jumping back, Sam, can you speak a little bit? There were a number of questions on governance, and I know you're sitting with the validators. So let's see, what's going on? What developments on EnergyWeb governance was kind of the high level question.
Sure. So, some of the kind of significant milestones, over the last couple of months or so, we're nearing 40 validators total, and I think we're up to 18 or 19 different countries now, which is really exciting. So, seeing that just geographic, but also the organizational diversity, we have, I think, as people have probably seen on, the visualization page, some of these really large, decades old Fortune 100 energy companies alongside some of these really innovative startups from around the world. And in this proof of authority governance model, what's pretty incredible about it is that those companies, it's equal voting power. So one organization, one vote. Some of the latest developments have really been focused on getting the validators more involved in some different areas. So building up a technical committee of validators who are going to have both greater accountability for kind of the administration of the chain and some planning, looking at upcoming forks or different technologies to incorporate, but also being more of kind of an advisory role and strategic input on some of the other things we're talking about, for example, with the utility layer. Some of the other committees and things that were in scope, there's also a big portion of the community fund that the validators govern there as well, that's specifically allocated for technologies or projects that directly impact the EnergyWeb chain. So things like different or new clients or different monitoring tools, different types of visualization tools, things like that are all kind of in scope there. And then obviously, I think the biggest role that the validators will play, certainly in the next 3 to 6 months, is being really instrumental in helping shape the utility layer. The validators have already proven themselves to be early adopters and willing, innovative partners in bringing the chain to life. And given that experience, as I mentioned, there's a lot of parallels with the utility layer services. So they're going to be a really key stakeholder in helping finalize some of these decisions that we were talking through earlier, and then actually implementing this initial version of the utility layer.
Excellent. Well, really excited to see where we get at the end of the year in terms of the validator set, geographic diversity. It's been amazing to watch the growth. Great. One other question coming in from a few places is, in previous AMAs, we mentioned partnerships with OEMs and auto companies. Has there been any significant progress on this front? So I think specifically this company, this questioner is probably talking we should talk about the Volkswagen announcement from last week, which is great. Also today, we announced that Hitachi and ABB Power Grids has joined EnergyWeb, which is amazing. This is a very large energy company, real diversity of activity. There's great use cases in terms of zero and origin from some of these large scale facilities they have. They also do a lot of work with software on distribution and transmission infrastructure. But last week, we did announce that Volkswagen has joined EnergyWeb as a member. And I think that's really big for us. One of our objectives for this year is to try and replicate what we're doing with VW with as many original equipment manufacturers. So that's the acronym OEM, manufacturer of these products. We want as many of them on board with us as possible, because what we can do and what we're doing with Volkswagen right now is integrating with their IT system, right? Our vision is the moment a grid operator says, we're ready to work with EnergyWeb, we can come to them with not just the EnergyWeb DOS stack, but also all of these other assets that we've pre-integrated with. Imagine if every Volkswagen car, if every charging station that they manage rolls off a production line and is equipped with a digital identity that's fully integrated with the EnergyWeb stack. That's amazingly powerful from a grid operator perspective, because you have these assets that the moment they're plugged in and there's some sort of a internet or telco kind of connection, so that data can come from these assets, it's trusted. It's part of the utilities operating system, and it's participating in the market. So really excited to have Volkswagen on board with the EnergyWeb community. They've been a great partner. We'll be announcing all the progress we can on that front this year. But that's the idea with that partnership and with all of these other OEMs, is how many of their assets can we basically pre-integrate with to make it easy for them to participate in markets around the world. That's the thinking.
Yeah, and that's not the only OEM. I mean, we have another one of our colleagues, Giannis, is working very closely with some other of our members, including like the SunSpec Alliance, who is itself a consortium of other OEMs, about when there are these standardized protocols for data exchange or identity, how can we create architectures at the hardware level that enable a secure management of private keys, that secure communication with the technology stack. And so publishing and socializing some of these really detailed kind of technical standards is another thing that we're working on kind of more broadly in the OEM space.
Yep, definitely. One other this is going to come across as a very self-serving question, but I swear we didn't edit this one. How much time will it take for distribution system operators, so this is a kind of utility, around the globe to start figuring out that EW DOS is what they need? So whoever asked that, clearly a fan of EnergyWeb. I did want to ask it, Sam, because you and I have worked with utilities for so many years. And I think it highlights a really important point. We spent most of this AMA talking about tech, right? But from my perspective, one of the biggest challenges right now is just helping these companies go through, call it digital transformation. These are organizations that really haven't pushed the envelope at all in many cases on that front in terms of digitizing processes. Getting onto a Zoom call with some of the partners we work with, getting onto a Google Hangouts meet is a big deal for some of these companies. And then we come in and start talking about Internet of Things, cryptocurrency, the staking model, right? So we have traction, it's working, but that question really does ring true for me, certainly, in that a lot of our work is just about helping these companies transform the way they do business. It's not even necessarily about the EnergyWeb stack at the front end of the conversation.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's also, it's such a wide spectrum for DSOs or distribution system operators is not even this one uniform category of utilities, depending on the type of market that they operate in, whether they, let's say, own generation or just the poles and wires, whether they're in a certain type of regulatory environment versus another. There's all these different things that kind of go into it, and there are some that are really pushing the envelope and thinking about how can we use a DID architecture for a cybersecurity use case for 4 million IoT sensors on our distribution grid, right? So that's, I mean, that's the cutting edge
Yep.
of anything that we know about. And then, as you pointed out, there are some that forget about even our technology, who may not even believe that distributed energy resources and electric vehicles are an important part of their business or their future. And so it's not even about a technology question. So, I think the way we've kind of gone about it is, well, let's find the companies where there's the greatest need now or the greatest opportunity. And a generalized observation about the energy sector is there are few companies really willing to kind of stick their neck out and be a pioneer and try something that's never been done before, because reliability is so important. It's generally a very conservative decision making. But then once something has been proven in a real, and I'm not talking about a pilot or a proof of concept, I'm talking about hundreds of thousands, millions of devices at scale in production. Once that proof point is there, many companies are very happy to be fast followers, and then it's a race to see, okay, they've done it, we want that too. An analogy is like how cloud computing kind of took off over in, like, it used to be, no way, everything has to stay on-prem. We're not outsourcing anything, all of our data lives here. But then a few companies got the hang of it, and suddenly everybody realizes the benefits. And now it's certainly not universal, right? But it took about a decade, and now cloud computing is certainly common, if not the majority of the way that a lot of these companies do their IT infrastructure.
Yep, definitely. I also think there's this really interesting juxtaposition. We just talked about Volkswagen. We used the Tesla example earlier. If anyone listening, has an electric vehicle or even a gas car, Sam, you shared a story the other day. I don't know if it's worth bringing up, but a lot of these assets themselves, so forget the utilities for a second, are quite digital, right? I get notifications from my phone if there's a slight voltage drop in the charging of my car, right? And that's a really sophisticated message going from my car through the internal routing system of my car manufacturer and then back to my phone. If you juxtapose that with the utility kind of IT and operating technology ecosystem, there's just this big gap, right, between these digital forward kind of asset companies and the grid operators. And that's how I think about what we're trying to do, is trying to fill that gap to make it really easy for grid operators to hook in, and vice versa for the asset manufacturers to hook in on the other side, and for that trust to be established between all these assets and customers and the utilities. That's how I think about it.
Yeah, I mean, I think obviously we're in agreement here, but for the community, I mean, one of the reasons why we think it's so important and valuable to have this open source, public, decentralized infrastructure layer for that identity and permissioning and that connection point is, if you're a grid operator, let's say, and you are just still kind of early on this digital transformation journey, you don't want to have to set up custom integrations with every single different, just think about all of the different EV manufacturers. There are going to be dozens of automakers with hundreds of electric vehicle models in the next couple of years, and you don't want to have to set up custom integrations with every single one of them. Conversely, I'll just use Volkswagen, right? They are in, if not every country on earth, probably pretty close. They do not want to have to set up custom integrations for their vehicles in every single market, in every single grid. And so if you have this universal, vendor agnostic, hardware agnostic, but trusted and collectively owned and operated by the industry digital infrastructure layer, that's a really powerful model to really bridge that gap between those two sides of the equation.
Well, that was pretty good summary of what we're trying to do. So I think we should probably leave it there. So thanks everybody for joining this AMA. We will get another one on the books as soon as possible. Please do keep the questions coming via all of the mediums, whether it's on Reddit, whether it's via Telegram. We really appreciate the feedback and try and respond to the community as these questions come in. So once again, thanks to Kobar for moderating, and we'll talk to you next time. Thanks, Sam.